Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on empowering critical thinkers with Ground News. Today, we will be learning about educating students on media bias in election season. I'm Sarah Gold with WiLS, and just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our guests. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all registrants. And I'm pleased to announce that Ground News is a WiLS partner, and Ground News is available to my WiLS members at a discounted rate that we will send out more information on that with the link to the recording. I'm pleased to welcome our guest, Rachel Perry, CEO and founder of Library Up, which is a library and education partner of Ground News. Rachel has facilitated our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Hallock, a professor of political science at Hartford College for 22 years. Dr. Hallock has been pivotal in implementing Ground News campus-wide, and through this, advancing modern news literacy education. An advocate of experiential education, Dr. Hallock will share with us some key topics around info literacy, including the difference between bias and fake news, identifying and addressing news blind spots, and media bias and election outcomes. So welcome to Dr. Stephanie Hallock and Rachel Perry.
Thank you, Sarah. I feel so special from that introduction. And thank you everyone for coming. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Rachel Perry. And about 2 years ago, I became an education and library partner with Ground News. I actually been in the library space for over 12 years now, and have worked in the digital space for the entire time. And my last position at B&T, Baker and Taylor, for those of you who are unfamiliar, that's when I discovered Ground News. And as a local Floridian, and somebody who's been in the library space for some time, like I mentioned, I just saw the power of Ground News, and I just couldn't, the limits of which it has in education, I just think it's really limitless. And after meeting Stephanie, Dr. Hallock, 2 years ago, I think I met her at my first political science conference. People like her just add energy and excitement to what I already have for this product. And today, we can go at a more in-depth demo on Ground News particular if you guys would like after this webinar. But our focus today really for everyone is going to be, how can we help you talk to your students about news in this election cycle? And the tools we're going to focus on with Ground News are going to be free. Of course, there are differences between the free version and the paid version, but there are some tools that I believe should be utilized by everyone prior to this election, not just students, not just librarians, but anybody who is going to vote and critically think about the news that they use before they make that decision to vote. So there are free features. Those are what we're going to highlight today. So again, regardless if you're a current customer, if you can use it this year or next year, I want there to be a takeaway for everybody. And Stephanie is going to dive into how she utilizes it specifically with her students at her school. And then later this, I think September, we're going to be presenting this and more in depth at the Political Science Conference. So there will be additional resources after September available for Ground News customers as well. But for today, everybody will be leaving the webinar with a lesson plan, and hopefully a more in-depth understanding of what Ground News is and then how it can be applied in education from the perspective of Stephanie. So with that, I'm going to get us started. And again, thank you everybody for joining today. And one last thing to mention, is we love taking questions. We've actually reserved time at the end for Q&A. So I highly, highly encourage everybody to use the chat to ask your questions, and we will answer them as we go, if appropriate, or save them for the end, because a lot of times questions that come about will get answered in the presentation. So we will be monitoring the chat for questions. So feel free to ask us whatever you want. Awesome. So I'm going to get started. today's webinar, I kind of touched on this, but just to kind of hone in a little bit more, we really hope that we can just equip librarians and educators with some extra tools to help your progress and process with media literacy, especially ahead of this pivotal time with the election. And then, of course, anybody that is thinking in this area, how can we enhance critical thinking for not just students, but everybody around us? So I really do feel this is a community tool. That was one of the reasons for adoption at Dr. Hallock's school, their community college. So they have to serve the whole community. So this tool made sense for them. The key topics we're going to talk about today, as Sarah mentioned, is the difference between bias and fake news, identifying and addressing blind spots, really going over why they're important to understand and recognize, and then the media bias and does it affect election outcomes? So, and we know a lot of us here on this call that media literacy is so important because it really does empower students to assess and think critically through the media that they're exposed to, and more importantly, how can they, as news consumers, what tools do they have to kind of combat modern technology when we talk about algorithms and AI? So obviously we need to equip them with some tools to combat that technology that is existing now. And the other thing that I think this lesson plan specifically does is it really does foster, informed engagement and civic involvement. And I think that is so important for the democratic process. So I'm excited to see kind of the outcome of that as well, for those of you who decide to take this to the classroom or to your lessons that you roll out in the library. So I'm going to start here with the difference between bias and fake news. So just to kind of take a step back before we dive into those two things, we have a couple topics that led us to this kind of problem here. So there is the problem with partisan media. So over the past decade, there's been online news, and it's been driven by algorithms that really make it profitable for these news outlets to embrace positions based on bias, rather than just reporting the news as it's presented in its form and factuality. The other thing here is the partisan media, if they target specific consumers that align with their biases that are present, then they obviously have a more captive audience and higher ratings. So that is another reason that we see these biases in the media as well. So it really does affect everything that we see. So from events that receive coverage to how news outlets frame that coverage. And as these news outlets continue to cover these things, the media outlets really, they start to narrow their perspective of the range of coverage, and it makes it near impossible for us as news consumers to consult a single source for a really well-rounded view of the news. So this kind of leads us into how many news sources do I need to use for this well-rounded coverage? Which ones are reliable? Which ones are not? Which one do I like? Which ones do I not like? And of those questions, what are the importance of asking them and implementing them? So the reason that it's important to be aware of these biases is because it helps us understand everything that goes into the news story before it ever gets presented to us. So it requires us to recognize that every author, editor, news source, owners of these news sources, they all have their own biases that go into the end product or what we see as the news story as it's reported to us. So to stay informed, we have to seek out multiple perspectives. No single source can consistently provide us with an unbiased view. And bias can stem from a multitude of things, but of course it can stem from domestic political disagreements, and of course, as well as geopolitical interests. So I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie at this point, so she can kind of just give us a brief background of understanding the origin of what we call today fake news.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm a political scientist, so I can't get away from that. But I do have, over 25 years in the classroom, and have seen, not just from a sort of a professional perspective, but also through my students' eyes, how things have evolved in terms of how they get information, how they perceive information. And of course, as you all know, it's sort of reached, well, what I hope is a critical mass, that it doesn't get worse than this. But it really goes back to the 1980s and deregulation. So the FCC always had a fairness doctrine that required, and it was a lot easier when there were three networks. Investigative journalists with Reuters, AP would pick up information, and then three networks would present it on TV. News publications would really take their cues from Reuters or AP or their own investigative journalists in terms of what they would present. But the fairness doctrine required that, particularly with airtime, everything be, if you give X number of hours to this candidate or this side of an issue, this perspective, then you have to do the same on the other side. So 1980s, you get the beginning of cable, and so multiple outlets. The part of the deregulation at the federal government, that fairness doctrine goes away, and that gives these cable outlets the ability to develop a niche, if you will, in terms of what they're going to present and how they're going to present it. And now they are vying for viewers, they're vying for advertising dollars, ultimately to build their brand. And, there are very few of the original cable, entities that are still alive today. A lot of them have disappeared. So that's really where it goes. And of course, the internet in the 1990s changes all of that again. And then satellite social media and all of that in the 2000s changes it again. So we talk about having a free press in the country, and we do. And what we mean by that is it's free from government control, but instead it's becomes under the control now of corporations and corporate interests, and corporations exist to make money. So that has really allowed, that deregulation really allowed all of the news outlets and news sources to kind of run off into different directions to find their market share and draw viewers. And we're going to get into more about, that's kind of all I was going to say on that. Now we're going to move into bias and fake news, I think, in another minute, right?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself. Thank you, Stephanie, for that.
Oh,
so
sure.
Just the background of those three things kind of segue into the lesson plan and also why GroundNews came about. So before we dive into Stephanie's lesson plan, I just want to give you some context of what GroundNews is and how we got here for those of you who haven't used it yet. And I just want to be very clear. This product started in the Apple Store retail space for everyday news consumers. The reason it has come into education and library space is because they received so many inquiries from educators and librarians about wanting to buy it for a whole campus or, of course, your whole library community. So I just want to be very clear that GroundNews was not built specifically to be used in the classroom, but it has evolved into that because of educators like Stephanie, who found the tool, saw it, and understands the need for something like it in the education space. So as we grow our education partners and our library partners, these lesson plans like you're going to see today, our repository of all of that is going to continue to grow as our community grows as well. And this year, we're actually going to start a Discord group so we can connect educators and librarians that are using it. So we're just really excited to continue to grow this community and then to continue to produce content and programming that is usable in the classroom for you. So GroundNews is an app, website, and it also has a browser extension that's super amazing as well. So there's several tools. There's a ton of email that you can subscribe to for GroundNews as well. But it's the world's largest news aggregator. So they aggregate over 50,000 sources globally and 60,000 articles daily. So just from that perspective alone, it's a pretty powerful tool. That is a lot of information to put in one place. So GroundNews, their main purpose for this is to bring all of this information, this news into one place, but in a way that's consumable for us, where we can apply our critical thinking and decision-making skills or media literacy skills. We can apply them to the news as we consume it in real time. So what do we need? What information do we need as news consumers to make these critical decisions before we actually go in, select a news source and read the story and take it at face value? So GroundNews, their goal is not to become a better news source. They are not a news source. They are not producing their own news. That is a very big key thing to note. They are aggregating the news again. Their goal is to provide us a neutral platform to consume the news. The other thing that GroundNews is not is they're not like some of these, companies that own these news sources. Like we're familiar with Jeff Bezos. He owns the Washington Post. The Koch brothers have a lot of their own news publications and sources that they own. So something that GroundNews does differently is they are not bound to a corporate parent company that is pushing a specific bias. Their goal is to remain as neutral as possible. And for that reason, they also do not work with advertisers. So their profitability does not depend on advertisers, which means that they do not have to be selective of what publications they choose to show and which ones they don't, which is what you'll find if you use a news aggregator like Apple News or Google News. They are very much heavily influenced by who advertises with them. And then, of course, they do definitely have big owners at Google and Apple who also have their biases as well. So that's often a question we get, what's the difference between these kind of two aggregators? And the other main difference too with GroundNews is they do not use algorithms that track what you read to show you something that you might like as well. This is something that we see everywhere, whether we're consuming news from Google News or Apple News or from social media, or even on a specific news site. Those algorithms trap us in a lot of times in an unknowing way. So all of that is what GroundNews is and what they're providing, which is why it's being so highly used in the education space. They're on a mission to well inform the world. And again, they're a very big mission-based company too. So they only the money they make is off of subscriptions, and then they put all of that money back into development to keep this running for us. The other neat thing I like to talk about with GroundNews is the founder, Harleen. She left her job as a rocket scientist at NASA to start and found this company because she just found it really unbelievable that we could all agree on these really high, these really intricate theories about outer space, but we have a really hard time agreeing on facts here on planet Earth. So she left her job as a rocket scientist to pursue this building a product that we could use to really use critical thinking in the moment as the news is breaking. She has an amazing TED Talk if you're interested, and there's also a lot of great articles, and she's been featured at a lot of podcasts. So if you just kind of want to learn more about their origin and why she chose to do this, it's a really great way to learn more about the company. And the last fun fact is they're Canadian. And so every time I meet with them, I just thank them on behalf of the US for doing us such a big service of providing us a tool like this, especially to help us assess the news in a critical way prior to such a big election. So Stephanie, with that, I'm going to hand that over to you so we can deep dive into your lesson plan and how you use GroundNews to teach distinguishing bias from lies in the media.
Okay, thank you. So what I've done with this for the purposes of the presentation is take something that I created as a classroom activity assignment for my American government classes, because before we can even begin to talk about or understand what's going on in the political arena, students really need to know what they think, what they believe, and how they acquire that information. And then most importantly, how they use that information. So I start, and I'm going to run through the activity part quickly, but you're going to all be able to have access to a copy of the whole assignment. It works not just for students, but it could also work as a professional development workshop that you could do with fact, I've done it with faculty, with my colleagues and peers. It could work in a community setting. I'm also an officer on our county's board of the League of Women Voters chapter. So I've used it with at the League of Women Voters to help raise awareness of what does it mean to be nonpartisan, which is a whole different level. But the whole thing is really grounded in knowing what you are looking for. So to that end, GroundNews, it becomes a tool that helps, again, it doesn't have to be students, can be anyone. In this context, it's students in my classroom, understand sort of the calculations, if you will, what's going on behind the scenes when they simply pick up a news source and read something or look at it. So the first piece I do is to give them context is we talk about these words that people throw around. And one of the biggest problems that my students have is distinguishing bias from just an outright lie. So they will pick up something, an article about something, or see a TikTok video increasingly about something. And if they don't agree with it, if it doesn't fit into what they already believe or think, then they say, well, that's a lie, right? That's something that is not true because it doesn't fit what my little world reality already is. So because it's so easy and readily available for them to go find then something that does fit into their reality. And as Rachel mentioned, over time, those algorithms don't even let you see the other stuff. They just feed you straight into it. So you're never really confronted with someone else's perspectives. So one of the big lessons that I start with is something can be biased. In other words, hey, this is definitely from a liberal perspective, right? This is a bias towards a certain political ideology or a view of how government should run. It can absolutely be biased, but it can also be factual. It can be true. It doesn't, just because you may be a conservative and you don't agree with that worldview doesn't mean what they're telling you are lies, right? And of course that works in all different directions. So I think the confusion or the cloudiness between these two really began with the whole concept of fake news in 2015, probably. The Trump campaign was the first one who used, what was her name? The notion of, well, those are your facts, right? Alternative facts. And that resonated with people because it helped them understand, oh, wait, I'm hearing something that I don't agree with or I don't like. That must mean it's their facts, not their perspective, not their bias, not their views, but their facts versus my facts. And that's really where the idea of fake news came in, that if it may be news, right? But it's your news, your facts, and it's not real for me, it's fake for me. So that's, I think, what we're now trying to combat, right? And to go back to that distinction between bias and lies. And what I start them with is just a simple thought, and I ask you to do the same. Does your political ideology, meaning what you sort of feel to be true, your ideas, your principles, and I pulled these from the Oxford Language Dictionary, these definitions, your view of how society should work, what the role of government should be, what the responsibilities of citizens is, that whole relationship in a governed society. Does that control what you know? In other words, are you driven by that to seek out the information that fits it? Or does your knowledge, the facts, the information, the things that you learn by starting as a child, right? The process by which you're socialized, what you learn and know through family, parents, education, schools, churches, how you process experiences at your local or national or global level. Does that knowledge control your political ideology? So that may be a little bit heavy for an early of the week, question, but there are two different things at play, and which one drives the other is an important thing for you to figure out on your own, just to be aware of before you start incorporating or bringing in any information, knowledge, news, experience, any media you're going to consume. You need a context to put that in. Okay, so sorry, Rachel. Yeah, next one. So the context becomes your political ideology. And, we always talk about left and right. Right being conservative, left being liberal. But it's actually, of course, much broader than that. And you've seen it depicted as horseshoes and all kinds of different shapes. But when we talk in American government, basically, we're talking right, left, meaning the view of society, of what you think the role of citizens is. So on here, it's marked as economic access. But in other words, the more conservative side of that is about more less government involvement, greater emphasis on individual rights. Conservative means, by definition, move slowly. If we're going to make changes, if we're going to do things, whether they're economic, social, whatever they are, move carefully, move cautiously, move slowly, versus the other extreme of that, which would be left, which is to say there should not be a great inequality in the distribution of resources in a society, right? It should be much more equitable. Strength comes from the society. Your individual rights are actually best represented, best played out when you are part of a strong society, where there's foundation and support for all of the individual perspectives. So these are a range. Very few people are, either at either end of a spectrum, despite what the political party system would have you believe. The vast majority of human beings are somewhere in the middle, and it's usually related sort of on an issue by issue basis, right? That's going to be because of the experiences you've had. If you've grown up in poverty, in an urban area that perhaps the city council was corrupt, you're going to have a very different view than if you grew up in a gated suburban community with a very strong, active community organization to maintain order. So experiences play into this a lot. The north-south range, if you will, there, authoritarian, libertarian, is what we generally think the role of government should be. So despite where you are on left or right, if you are towards the top end of the authoritarian end of that, you believe that government should be very involved in establishing rules, guidelines, parameters, expectations. I mean, at its extreme, obviously it becomes totalitarianism, right? The other end of that is libertarian, which is to say that the government should not be terribly involved, and people should be granted the freedom to explore, live their social lives, their economic lives, their selves, their individuals, without government establishing and setting parameters and expectations, that society can take care of that itself. So you've seen, and again, no one is at these, very few people live at these far extremes. Most people believe sort of in the center. Organizations, political parties, do better when they pull you to the edges, because what they've done is they say, well, actually, let's go to the next slide. That would be perfect. What they do is the parties, the organizations say, we want to be able to capture the most individuals possible. So by going to the extreme, the party can pull anybody from sort of that center point to the left or top left, or the other way around. So what you see here is that same sort of, and it's flipped, and I apologize for that, but the authoritarian is on the bottom in this one, and libertarian is on the top. And I apologize for that, because the last one was more of a I got it from a different source, obviously. But the graph situation is the same, is that people may be in the middle, but when you look at the organizations, political parties, you see that they are sort of pulled off to the edges, not in the center. We think of ourselves as a two-party system, and we are a two-party dominant system and always have been. So you see the Republicans over there in that top right quadrant, far to the right, sort of towards the center on the libertarian side of things. And you see the Democratic Party over on the left, it's the blue D, more towards the authoritarian side of the north-south spectrum, right? But on the left. And what that means is the Democratic Party generally believes that government should be more involved in leading, guiding, establishing progressive policies. And the Republican Party believes that there should be more freedom granted, and this is traditionally granted to individuals, but again, not far off center. There obviously needs to be a government and that the government's job is to sort of pull the reins in, right? To keep it conservative, to slow things down at that government level and give people time to adjust in their own, sort of in their own lives. So I put all these other parties on here because we do have what we call minor parties, right? Or third parties. And they tend to appear at state levels. I'm in Maryland. In Maryland, the Libertarian Party is actually really, really big. But the parties that you see on here are parties that have qualified to be on the ballot in 10 or more states. In other words, they aren't just a state issue, but these are parties that have managed to become more regional in nature rather than simply at the state level. So they are parties that are growing, they're picking up support in enough states, 10 or more states, that they are considered sort of viable. These people from these parties they're considered viable candidates. Again, at this point, I would stop with my students and say, how many of these have you even heard of? We talked a little bit about what surprises them, meaning that no one's in the center, and yet the organizations aren't in the center, yet Americans tend to be in the center. All right, so here's what we would do then. And again, I do this with students, but you could do it with any group whatsoever. Once they do this exploration and they do a little political ideology test to determine where they fall ideologically by looking at some policy questions, I have them divide themselves into sort of three broad groups, left, center, right. Where do you fall on the spectrum yourself? And if it's a large group of students, I have them further subdivide. If it's a smaller group, we just leave it into those three groups. And I have each group take a different approach. So one group will take we'll choose the same topic as a class. But then one group would look specifically at articles that are leaning toward their bias. So if we say the group that says, oh, we identify to the left, choose an article, and the example here is the article of Kamala Harris praising the defund the police movement back in June 2020. So it's an article now about what she said back then. So I would have a group of students that self-identify as left look at that from a perspective that is a left perspective. Another group that would lean against their bias. So if I say that I'm left, let me look at it from a right perspective and see what that is. And then also from a centrist perspective. So the idea is that we're getting different people who maybe all self-identify as leaning one way or another to really do the work of looking at things from finding an article that approaches it from a different bias, not factuality. The factuality score has to be good on all of them, but bias, and then having a conversation about what that means. So you can go to the next one. And then basically I ask each of these subgroups to come together into the larger group and talk about what are the differences between the articles? So let's start with the centrist perspective. It's hopefully going to either be nonpartisan, and that it's going to provide simply facts and very little bias, or it's going to include perspectives from the left and the right. Either one of those could make it a centrist argument. And then compare that to the articles written from a left bias perspective or a right bias perspective. Are there facts or details that are different between them? Or more importantly, are there things that one article talks about that another one doesn't even mention at all? And why is that? And again, who's the publisher of this? What market share are they trying to buy? And when you look at things, as a group, when they look at things from a centrist left and right perspective, how does that change what they would have known, quote unquote, if they only looked at it from one bias or another? We can move on. So when these groups then think about this and they sort of give a presentation, it leads to a nice way for the entire group or the entire classroom to get into not what the article, we're beyond the level of what the article is about, right? At that point, we are into the why is it different? Why would it be that if this is an event, this is a fact, this is a something that's happened, why would it be that looking at it from a left bias perspective gives me a different perception or take than looking at it from a right bias perspective? And that gets us into the conversation between fake news and biased, which is, again, the thing I'm sort of trying to solve for with this activity. To recognize that just because something is biased doesn't mean it's a lie, it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that they have a particular message that they are trying to give you. And if you only live in the rabbit hole of that bias, if you allow the algorithms to determine that you're only going to read things from a particular bias, and you never seek out the center, or you never seek out something from a different perspective, you're never actually going to have a true sense of what's going on. You're never going to get the full story. So in your effort to stay away from lies or fake news, you may be erring on the side of only reading from one bias. Does that make sense? So I have them sort of think about that on their way out. That's what we, in education, or teaching, I should say, pedagogy, call an exit ticket, right? So you do an activity as a group, you work through these things, and then sort of on their own, this is the takeaway that I wanted them to walk away with. Now, Rachel's going to show you. So that would be the assignment or the overall classroom activity that I would do, and they would be using GroundNews on this. So now Rachel's going to show you exactly how they will use GroundNews to be able to do this activity in class.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So I loved this. Stephanie actually had this infographic in her presentation that she sent to me, and it's an IFLA infographic. So I know a lot of librarians on here can resonate with that. One of the things, we see a lot of these resources like News Literacy Project. That's a really great place for things like this and helping your students understand and identify bias and fake news. But what I wanted to do is really highlight why, professors like Stephanie are choosing to pair all of these media literacy skills that are being taught, but also with the tool of GroundNews, because a lot of the lesson plans a lot of the activities in the lesson that we just reviewed, without a tool like GroundNews, it would be very time consuming to get all of this done, and maybe not allow you to see the full scope of everything, and arrive at the conclusion that you would in a reasonable amount of time. Like, is this something we're going to learn about this week versus this semester? So with GroundNews, it really puts everything in one place so you can execute these critical decision-making skills on the go in real time as news is breaking and as news is happening. The other thing, that's very helpful for us news consumers in our daily lives. But the other thing that really is great for education is it just elevates the conversation to where you're talking about your own biases or the difference between fake news and biased news, as opposed to spending all of your time in discussions going over which news source you prefer and things like that. So what I like to tell people is GroundNews really takes these discussions from, GroundNews takes it from 0 to 60. So the really important remaining 40% of these discussions can actually be delved into deeply with your class and your programming, as opposed to only ever getting to the part about which news sources are we using, right? So GroundNews really helps us get to the meat and potatoes of the conversation that's necessary for us to kind of come together in a society, even if we don't necessarily agree or we're on the different spectrums of political party affiliation. If we all kind of start from the same place and are using the same tools when we're evaluating our news source, it really helps elevate that conversation so much more. And I think it helps us engage in news in general more. For me personally, I went from just being so overwhelmed and I stopped trusting it altogether because I did not have the tools I needed to go evaluate other sources as quickly as I needed to start trusting the news again. So having all of these tools and resources in one place really kind of amplifies what you're able to accomplish with your class and your teaching very quickly. So here I just wanted to map out, consider the source. GroundNews puts the source at every level here. You can see here are all the sources that are covering this one topic. So instantly you're able to kind of look at your source, but also see all of the other supporting sources quickly. So rather than sorting through print paper and websites and all of these other different things that you would have to do manually prior to a tool like GroundNews, you're actually able to do this much, much quicker in GroundNews. Reading beyond the headlines, right? So because we have the tools we need to critically evaluate the sources, who owns them, all of those things, we can actually get to the news and feel confident once we start reading those headlines. Again, we're not reading the world of bias. That's not the goal. It's also not possible. We all have inherent bias. The goal of GroundNews is to help news consumers understand and identify the bias. So prior to ever reading the full source, they can understand, here are the things I need to consider while reading this article from this particular source. Checking the date, I think, is really important. A lot of times news stories are regurgitated. And depending on like our last example with the Kamala Harris, that was a story from 2020. Why is that resurfacing again now? So dates are very important to getting to the bottom of why is something being reported on and by who. So GroundNews has a really great tool of where we can see this is the news source that broke it. This is when they broke it. And then here are all the other news sources that picked it up and started reporting on it as well. The other thing that's obviously important is ask the experts. If they are not, if they're out of school and they're on the go reading news and they don't have access to a librarian right away, another great resource is that often librarians point them to are these independent news monitoring organizations like Ad Fontes, Media Bias Fact Check, and All Sides. So GroundNews is not coming up with these ratings themselves. What they did is they built a way to average all of these different independent news monitoring sources that are already being used as resources in the classroom. They're bringing them together all into one place and giving us an average. Again, they're not deciding the rating, just like they're not publishing the news. They're just putting everything in the same place so we can access this very necessary information all from one place. So you can see our media bias visualization ratings derived from Ad Fontes, All Sides, Media Bias Fact Check. And then you can see where the factuality ratings derive from. And all of these are linked out and go specifically to that page within that independent news monitoring organization. So if your students or you're asking your students to do an activity on why, if your students say, well, I don't believe this news source is biased, I don't think it's right, I think it's left, or the other way around, we can then easily point them to these sources, and then they can look into why they have been labeled that way. The other thing is ownership. Ownership, again, is very important. We've talked about that. So for every news source that is in GroundNews, you have this amazing kind of profile overview of the news source. And then, of course, everything that they pull in, they link out to. So you can easily see, and their goal, again, is transparency as well. So now that we kind of see these screenshots and how they tie into this, I just want to jump in to the actual product itself. And then this way we can kind of look at it through the context of the lesson plan that we just reviewed, and understanding some of the tools. So this is the current Vote 2024 hub on the GroundNews website. This again is a free feature that you can use. There are many paid features in GroundNews that are really good for education. There are limits that you're going to run into everywhere else in the platform, but for the sake of our election and our need as news consumers, GroundNews has put this up, and it's a free tool that you can access. They will be pulling it down after the election commences. So at the very minimum, if you as a news consumer are just trying to kind of wrap your head around the election without having to dive into a million different sources, this is a really great hub to start with. And then, of course, if you're doing activities like Stephanie has shared, again, this is a great place to go. So what they've done here is they've categorized the candidates, the issues, election coverage. So this is going to election coverage being the news about the election. And then, of course, blind spots as well, which we can get into that in a minute. But I'm just going to click into a story here so we can just talk about some of the activities. So one of the things that Stephanie touched on is kind of how is the story being reported from the left and the right, and what are the differences in those biases in the language, and how does that come off? So with GroundNews, you can click over and say, here's how the left is reporting on it, here's how the center is reporting on it, and here's how the right has been reporting on it. So by giving your students access to this tool, then we can have those in-depth conversations in the lesson plans that Stephanie was reviewing for us. The other thing you'll see over here is, again, we're putting all of the information you need to execute not just the lesson plans, but again, critically evaluating sources in real time. So you can see how many sources have covered this. So this can tell us, a bunch of things, right? This is obviously a really big story. We have 157 sources, so we can immediately see the scale of coverage. We can also see how kind of equally dispersed it's being covered, which again, there's a lot of, well, why is that? Why is every source covering it? Is it breaking news? Is it super important to everybody? So those are just immediately leads us to more questions to kind of dive deeper into what we're actually reading about. We can see the bias distribution here. And these are, one thing to note, bias and factuality ratings and visualizations, those are not based on the article individually themselves. They're based on the news source or publication as a whole. So we've seen a lot of new news publications pop up recently in the past couple of years, digital only news publications. And sometimes you can say, oh, I've never heard of this source, so I don't trust it. But that's not necessarily correct. I found myself personally, this past year, journalism awards, for the first time ever, there was more awards given to journalists from digital news publications than print. So just because it's new doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but by GroundNews showing us what has tracked and what has untracked, it just tells us, hey, we don't really understand the bias or factuality of this news source yet because they're very new, but that just lets us know we need to go further investigate on our own. And then here, when we're talking about reading across sources, you can see on GroundNews that here's everything. This is all in, this view is going to be the same for everybody, no matter what your preference is. Again, so we're not trapping you in algorithms. We're not going to say, hey, you typically read right, so we're going to default land on this page. That will never be the case. So GroundNews homepage and these default feeds will look the same for everybody. I like to say that's very helpful because we're all starting from the same place versus all starting from our own algorithms and echo chambers. And then, of course, based on your preferences, again, you can choose what you want to read. And then again, you can take all of the other appropriate kind of information into context. Like how factual are the sources that are reporting on it? So 82% of these sources are high factuality sources. So again, what can we infer from that? These are questions that can be discussed in the classroom or with family members over holidays, if you dare. And then, of course, we have the ownership ratings or ownership labels. This is super helpful for me personally, and I think, again, just triggering more conversation and more questions. Why is an outlet owned by Jeff Bezos reporting on this? Or even better, why are they not covering this? So you can drill down to, high level, how many of these sources are media conglomerates versus independent news sources versus government run news sources. And then within that, you can go down even further, the company that owns it, and then what are the sources do they own? So again, this one company owns this many sources, right? So when we say we're reading across spectrum or reading from different sources, if we're reading all from the same ownership, are we really kind of reading across the whole spectrum? So just a lot of information that we can use on the go to make sure that we are doing our job of critically evaluating our sources. The other thing that's really helpful in here is the event timeline. So some news stories kind of, again, like the COVID lab leak is a really good example. That was reported on over like a year and a half. So watching these timelines and how the coverage is being reported on, like why are they talking about this now versus this was a story 2 years ago. Again, why are they bringing it up today? So these timelines give us a lot of, again, more things to think about. And again, we're never going to tell you what to read next based on what you read before, but there are ways that you can personalize it. We all know that we want to personalize things that are important to us. So there is still the option of personalizing things here, but you're never going to have a different feed than anybody else when you're on the homepage or the election homepage. That's all going to be the same for everybody. I clicked on the picture. So identifying and addressing blind spots. I know we're running up to the end here, so I just want to focus on this quickly because I think blind spots are very important. Sometimes we find ourselves, well, I'm reading from a high factuality source. I know my source is, credible. It's biased, sure, but doesn't have as much bias as you'll find in other sources. So why do I need to read outside of that? I think, for GroundNews is, I love their saying, you need to read in somebody else's shoes to fully understand why they believe what they want. So if we're trying to engage in open conversations and dialogue and from an empathetic standpoint rather than an accusatory standpoint, understanding what other people are reading outside of what you normally read is so critical for this. My personal example of this is, I mentioned I'm from Florida. My dad and I have very different political beliefs because of our age and a myriad of reasons. But after finding GroundNews, it just helped me understand so much more why he believes what he believes in certain topics, because I was never exposed to what he was reading prior to that. So being exposed to things that you wouldn't normally read doesn't mean you have to believe them and love them and start using them, but it really helps you understand why other people have different viewpoints than you. And so recognizing blind spots. Again, this would be near impossible for us to do without a tool like GroundNews. So they use their patent technology to, again, bring everything in, and then they highlight kind of disproportionate coverage on the left and the right. So we can see that, again, doesn't tell us anything explicitly, but it helps us draw our conclusions when we see them. So if we click on, if we want to go to media bias and the election outcomes, more specifically, we can go back to the election page. Stephanie, I'm going to come back to that if that's okay. They have a specific blind spot page for the election, which I think is so important. Not just to know what is getting lopsided coverage on your side or the other, but I think more importantly, what isn't being covered. So why wouldn't somebody who has a left-leaning bias report on a specific topic? And why are they the only ones reporting on that topic? So there's a lot of great questions that you can pull from this. And also, again, accountability for yourself to see what you wouldn't normally see because of your preferences or your own inherent biases. So Stephanie, I'm going to go back to your slide so you can just talk about that for a minute in the context of your lesson.
Yeah, and I want to leave time for questions. I just wanted to come back to this question where we started, because I think once you dig in, and I think, we've scratched the surface today here on what GroundNews, like the opportunities to sort of play with, if you will, got lost in all that GroundNews has to offer. For me, we have embedded librarians, research reference librarians in our classes. They literally, like, whether it's an online or face-to-face, they will literally come to the classroom, or come into the online class and at the beginning of the semester and talk to students about what media literacy is and what resources they have at the library, the best practices, all those kinds of things. But I find that students don't view that as a foundation to build upon so much as like, okay, checked that box, on the syllabus, got done, now we're going to do the next thing, rather than really viewing it as the foundation of everything we're doing for the course. So one of the reasons that our institution got GroundNews was for us to be able to have this tool for students that and faculty to use, and again, community. But once they understand sort of why it matters and what's important, then they have this tool that they can go back to and spend, again, as little or as much time as they want, really digging in and exploring things for themselves, for their own understanding, to improve their own understanding on things. So it gets back to that question of what drives what, and what I find is the beginning of the semester, students will say, well, I know I'm a conservative and you're not going to change my mind, or I'm a liberal and you're not going to change my mind. Great. No one wants to change your mind, but what you need to understand is all of what that means. Who's defining it? Well, what it means to be liberal to you? Who's defining what it means to be conservative to you? And until you really do that exploration, your knowledge of, you're letting that knowledge of your political ideology determine which news sources, what information you get.
I just wanted to see this.
Once you dig through this and you've gone through all this, you get to a better realization of, wait a minute, I know why I am conservative on this perspective, or liberal on this perspective, or better yet, conservative on this one and liberal on this one, because I've looked at it from a variety of different issues. So I find that sort of from a social science perspective, no one's changing their political perspectives as a result of having this tool necessarily. What they are is building a stronger foundation for why they know what they know, why they believe what they believe. So again, I want to see what questions you guys have. I'm more than happy to stick around for as long as anybody wants to talk to.
Thank you, Rachel and Stephanie.
Yes.
Just checking the chat here. Do you have a more in-depth plan for those of us with subscriptions at the high school level?
That's a great question. And hi, Kathy. Kathy was one of our first early adopters in Wisconsin, so I really appreciate you being here. And the answer to that question is we're working on it, because really the big thing here is, like we've said a million times with GroundNews, is they're not out to tell people what to believe or what to think. It's how can we give you the information you need to do that on your own. So with that in mind, coming up with programming from GroundNews, it almost kind of gets into, here's how you use our tool, which kind of can get into here's what you should do with it. And that's what they want to stay away from wholeheartedly. So my goal as, the owner of Library Up is to closely partner with the educators, Kathy, like yourself, and other high schools that are using it, so we can do shared resources and programming between you guys. So we are building a massive repository as we collect these lesson plans, like Stephanie has shared with us today. One of the things we're working on is piloting potentially like a discount as you contribute lesson plans as well. And we are going to start up a Discord group this year so we can connect educators and librarians so they can share planning and high school programming as well. Not just high school, but of course, some of the community college programming might be relevant for high school, right? So yes, we have some stuff. Stephanie, I see your comment there as well. And I know Stephanie is building a repository within her local community at her college as well. So we are going to have more of that for you, Kathy, as we evolve and grow our education user base.
Thank you, Kathy, for your question. I'm just looking at the time. It's 11 o'clock, so we're going to start losing some people. So I just wanted to share Rachel's email address, as well as the Library Up website address. And then if you're interested in a trial or pricing for the paid version of GroundNews, I have shared our price quote request form. I know that Stephanie and Rachel are willing to stay around if there are any additional questions. Stephanie also just shared her email address. I will go ahead and thank everyone for attending, reminding you that we will send out the link to the webinar. And if anybody has questions, I'm going to stop the recording, but we can hang around for a bit and see if.
And Sarah, I just dropped the PDF of the lesson plan today because that was really important that we gave you guys something to take away with you. But of course, we can share the full presentation with the link to the webinar if that is of interest as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.